Hello and welcome to Fireside Chats on Nomura Podcasts. I'm your host Jordan Rochester from the Global Markets Research Team, and in this episode of our Fireside, we'll be talking with Lewis Alexander and Robert Dent from our US Economics team on their thoughts for the US fiscal outlook, as well as how that feeds into their expectations for growth, inflation, and of course the Fed. I'll be asking Lewis and Rob, how much fiscal support should we expect to see from the US this year? What does that mean for growth, inflation, and of course the politics? And how should that feed into their Fed view and Red's pricing as well? First of all, welcome Lewis and Rob. It's been a while since we did a podcast on the US, and there really is a lot to catch up on. I want to get a quick take from you on the state of the US fiscal outlook and how that feeds into your view for the economy. We've all seen the ramp up of the US vaccinations, and that's also having a real world impact, both big and small. But in this podcast, I want to get really specific into the details of that US fiscal policy and the upcoming infrastructure bill. So Lewis, as a recap, how much fiscal support has the US done, and how does that feed through to your view?
The US has done a huge amount. Obviously, last year we had a fiscal deficit that was on the order of 15% of GDP. Moreover, the Biden administration has passed its American Recovery Plan, which is going to spend another $1.9 trillion. $1.2 trillion of that is going to spend out before the end of September. That's a very large amount of fiscal support. It's going to boost growth at the beginning of the year, particularly strongly. We think in the current quarter growth is going to be about 4 to 5%. We think it's going to be 8% in the second quarter, and we're going to have 6% growth in the second half of the year. So that's obviously a very strong performance.
Now, Lewis, it's been the topic of conversation from pretty much most of Q1, which is we saw that big move in rates, and a part of that conversation was about the inflation outlook. Will all this stimulus lead to outsized inflation in your view?
So the U.S. economy is expanding quite rapidly, and we are running into some supply constraints of one form or another. That is going to push up inflation in the short run. You're going to see that in both goods and services. But we think those supply constraints are things that are not going to be long-lasting problems. And so our expectation is that while inflation is going to be high this year, it's actually going to fall back down next year as those constraints diminish. And it's really only in 2023, after the economy has been operating essentially at full employment for an extended period of time, that we expect inflation to go above 2% on a durable basis.
Now, let's talk about the upcoming proposals in the US political space. So, Rob, let's bring you in here. President Biden has just proposed the Americans Jobs Plan. What are the key elements of the AJP, and how does that fit into Biden's broader agenda?
Yeah, so thanks, Jordan. This is a great question. The American Jobs Plan does a really great job of kind of wrapping together some of Biden's campaign proposals into one sort of comprehensive bill. You've got a significant amount of spending on kind of your bread and butter infrastructure projects. That includes about $200 billion for roads and bridges, about $400 billion for drinking water, broadband, and electricity, and then around $400 billion for sustainable housing and buildings. In addition, Biden is proposing about $600 billion for investments related to domestic U.S. manufacturing. That was a very big part of his campaign, and these policies include, significant investments in high-tech R&D, manufacturing, and workforce training. And we think the manufacturing part is kind of a critical component of the overall proposal. It does address one of the major shortcomings of U.S. macro policy over recent decades, both for Democrats and Republicans. So, you think about your typical macro 101 textbook, globalization is viewed as being kind of a net benefit for macro outcomes overall relative to something like a closed economy. The basic problem that Biden is trying to address is that globalization has really nevertheless left many people behind. The economic benefits haven't been widely shared, and I think there are some groups that have been disproportionately disadvantaged over a long period of time. And so we think this is particularly true for many rural U.S. communities who previously depended on kind of manufacturing activity for overall growth. And so this part of the plan is really aimed at addressing those problems. Finally, Biden is proposing about $400 billion in spending related to expanded care for the elderly and disabled. This is a little bit more related to kind of the second part of his proposal, which is going to center more on caregiving. We think that's going to get rolled out later this month. He's calling it the American Family Plan, or AFP. And we think that's going to include about another $1 trillion or so in proposed spending over 10 years. Many of these policies have been pretty bipartisan in the past, but Biden is using them to kind of advance his broader agenda aimed at really addressing kind of climate-related issues and economic inequality more broadly. So this does go a bit beyond your typical infrastructure initiative.
As Rob just said there, Lewis, it goes beyond your typical sort of initiative. Let's try and put that into an historical context. Let's put this debate into that historical context. Is there any precedent for what has happened under COVID-19, the sort of US spending? Have we had a similar move in terms of fiscal deficits in the past? Is the global financial crisis the right template for us all, or should we look much further back in history to the likes of World War II?
No, so I don't think the global financial crisis is really the right way to think about this. First of all, what happened under COVID-19 is much more like what happened under World War I, World War II, national emergencies, when you saw these very large fiscal expansions in the context of a very unusual circumstance. What's happening going forward is really something quite unusual. In the past, you've seen big fiscal expansions other than in national emergencies under really two circumstances. One, where there's a broad national consensus, things like the interstate highway system, Cold War military spending is a good example. Or when there is a sort of landslide election that produces a clear mandate towards higher spending. So this is, you can think of the New Deal in the 30s, you can think of Johnson's Great Society in the 60s. What Biden is trying to do is really unlike that, in the sense that he's essentially proposing a big quasi-permanent expansion of the role of government in an environment where, the majorities in Congress are razor thin. Whatever you think about the election in 2020, it was not a landslide election. And so I think how those political constraints play out as we work our way through this bill is going to determine how this goes.
What are the precedents for what Biden's actually trying to do, Lewis, in regards to US fiscal policy? So you've mentioned a few things there, but there's other initiatives as well in the pipeline. So how will that work out?
Well, look, I think the infrastructure bill, there are certainly parts of it that are akin to previous efforts, like the building of the interstate highway system, where conceivably there could be broad support and you could see that work out. But it's important to recognize that that's only a piece of it. There is a much broader part of the agenda, which is designed, frankly, to deal with income inequality, and it's designed to expand opportunity. There's also a climate component, which is, again, new. A lot of that is aimed at supporting the conversion to essentially an all-electric economy. So a lot of it's related to producing an electric car industry that's viable in the U.S. There aren't really precedents for that in the U.S., and we're going to have to see whether or not Biden can get those things adopted in an environment where he has very narrow majorities in Congress.
Rob, coming back to Joe Biden's proposals, let's talk less about the numbers now and more about the congressional steps ahead. We've spoken about bipartisanship, but will Biden's proposals get any Republican support? And does it actually need Republican support?
Yeah, so, at this point, we are pretty skeptical that Republicans are going to support kind of what Biden has put forward so far. Republicans have been pretty slow to actually formulate a concrete message in opposition to Biden's proposals, but almost no congressional Republicans have come out and said they actually support this type of spending and tax initiative. So some moderates have suggested they might support a very stripped down version that just focuses on kind of the bread and butter transportation components. But, to us, we think this is just going to follow a similar route relative to the American Rescue Plan, which passed last March. There's probably going to be at least a few efforts to make it more bipartisan, but ultimately Democrats are going to move forward and try to pass it on their own using budget reconciliation. At the end of the day, as long as they have unanimous support within their caucus, and as Lou said, I mean, the margins there are razor thin, they can still enact almost all of what Biden is proposing without Republican votes.
Well, the other part of that, Rob, is taxes. You noted how there is within the House and the Senate some opposition against more deficit spending on top of what's already been spent. But typically raising taxes is tough. And I'm not sure the market actually prices it in fully as well, given how tough it can be to get the politics of it through. But Rob, will the Democrats in Congress support Biden's tax proposals, and will that make it through to what's finally agreed?
So we currently do not expect significant tax increases, but I think the risk around that view has been steadily rising over recent weeks. Our economic outlook really just incorporates about $2 trillion in additional spending over 10 years that we think is going to be enacted sometime in Q3. But, at this point, it really wouldn't be surprising at all if we ended up in a scenario where they settled on, maybe $3 trillion in spending and $1 trillion in tax increases over 10 years. We don't think that moderate Democrats are going to support the type of tax increases that Biden has proposed kind of outright. We've already seen some moderate senators like Senator Manchin from West Virginia come out and say that he's not going to support raising the corporate tax rate to something like 28% from the current level of 21%. But Manchin has been open to raising the corporate rate to something like 25%. And so that does seem increasingly likely. Moreover, Biden is going to talk later this month about unwinding some of the tax cuts that were implemented under the Trump administration for very high income earners. So these are largely people that are making above $400,000 each year. And so that might be something that gets folded into the final proposal. And Biden has really proposed a number of different changes to how to treat multinational corporations to try to pay for some of this increased spending. And the international tax changes, the outlook for those is even more uncertain, just given how complicated those types of initiatives can be. And the very, very narrow margins that Democrats are facing.
Okay, well, run us through the timeline of what to expect then, Rob. When should we have a better sense of what's going to happen? Is it this quarter, or is it more like the third quarter this year?
So that's a good question. Between now and expected passage in Q3, we think there are a couple of things to watch. So first of all, Biden is supposed to be giving a speech later in April, outlining the American Family Plan. This is where we expect to learn more about proposed spending on kind of caregiving and proposals for raising taxes on high-income individuals. Ultimately, we think that the AJP and the American Family Plan, or AFP, are going to be combined into one bill. Similar to the ARP, Democrats are going to need to pass a fiscal year 22 budget resolution. We think that's going to happen around the end of May, and that kind of unlocks the whole reconciliation process that allows them to pass this thing using only Democratic votes. So that's very similar to what we saw play out over the past couple of months with the American Rescue Plan. While they're working on drafting the budget resolution, we think lawmakers are going to begin drafting actual legislative text and trying to reach a consensus within the Democratic caucus on kind of what the final size should look like. That's when comments from both moderate and progressive lawmakers are going to be particularly important. So as Lou was talking about earlier, Democrats need essentially complete unity within their caucus for this to actually pass without Republican votes. Now, all of that we think is going to get done by late May, sometime in June. So this is a much more prolonged timeline compared to the ARP. But once all of that is done, Speaker Pelosi has said that she wants the House to pass that package before the July 4th holiday. And then the Senate would, in theory, pass it on their end before the August recess. So that's kind of our current baseline. But I would just note that's a very, very ambitious schedule, and it could slip by a couple of weeks.
Okay, I see. So the sort of summer period is where we should be looking at. Well, Lewis, I think about surprises all the time. Where could we be wrong about our outlook? And I guess one of the surprises this year is just how much Joe Biden has been able to get done without too many hurdles. And that's because the Democrats stayed together on that reconciliation path, getting the COVID rescue package done. Now, going forward, reconciliation can only be used so many times. And so Joe Biden might run out of a path to get things done. But what about reform, Lewis? So could we see a surprise in terms of filibuster reform? And that could solve the problem for President Biden here. Or if not, what else could we see?
So it's certainly possible that the filibuster could be eliminated. That is, there are people within the Democratic Party who are arguing for that. And it is a constraint on the non-spending and tax side of what Biden might want to do. At the moment, I don't think the votes are there for it. So you have a small number of Democratic senators, but they need every single one of them to change the rules. There are a small number of senators that are, for the moment at least, opposing that change. So I think it's important to be clear that I think as far as spending and taxes go, they've got enough scope under the existing rules to kind of do what they need to do, assuming they can maintain support within the Democratic caucus. So that isn't really the issue. This is really more an issue for things that aren't directly spending issues, things like immigration, those kinds of things that where it is a bigger deal. Election reform is another one that's important. Look, I think you're right to highlight the fact that it's been surprising how much Biden has been able to get done, how quickly, how, to be frank, disorganized the opposition to Biden has been so far. I don't expect that condition to last, but it is certainly possible that one of the ways we could be wrong is that Biden can just do more of his agenda than we would expect. So that firstly comes in the direct fiscal stuff. So more spending, more taxes than we have built into our baseline is certainly possible. But it could extend out beyond that as well, as you say, if they can get the votes to change the filibuster rule. They don't have it at the moment, but that's possible.
Well, let's move on now and talk about what could happen next for the Fed and the impact on markets as well. So, Lewis, I think we have to always address the sort of elephant in the room for pretty much any FX trade or any trade that's related to the risk appetite of the market, because that's driven by what happens in long-end US rates. There's discussion about what this all means for fiscal spending and what that means for debt sustainability. But Lewis, we're at levels in US Treasuries that are now matching that of the pre-COVID era in terms of yield. Is the market seriously concerned about debt sustainability, or has that move in US rates been mostly a repricing of growth expectations?
I think it's been almost completely a repricing of growth expectations. To be perfectly frank, I don't think the market is particularly concerned about fiscal sustainability in the US. One of the things I would emphasize is the generally low level of US rates, and in particular the low level of neutral rates, means that any fiscal policy in the US is more sustainable than it would be otherwise. And so I just see little evidence that people are seriously concerned about the long-run fiscal outlook and that that's what's driving rates. Look, at the level of long rates now, they are consistent with the Fed's estimates of terminal rates in this cycle for hiking rates. And they're a little bit aggressive relative to what the Fed has told us their hiking schedule would be. But I think it's hard to make the argument that there's any component in long rates at this point that is particularly related to concerns about the sustainability of the fiscal accounts. It's obviously relevant for growth. It's relevant for how quickly the Fed is going to get to liftoff and all of that. But that's separate from that other issue.
Well, but that's the long end rates. What about the short end pricing too? I mean, in your forecast profile for the Fed, in terms of liftoff when they start to raise rates, you have that penciled in for around the third quarter of 2023. And that's 25 basis point rate hikes. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then every 6 months, you have another 25 basis points. Right. I just want to make a point of it because looking at March 2024, which is less than 3 years' time now, so it's quite easy to strip out the curve. We have, and that's Nomura, has penciled in 50 basis points of rate hikes by that point. But the market's pricing nearly double that. We had 100 basis points about a week or so ago. It's now 90 basis points. And of course, this is 3 years away, so it's a long time to wait and see. But Lewis, in short, is this fiscal spending going to be a long-lasting regime change for the US? And are the risks to that profile of the Fed to the top side, so they hike more, or is it more to the downside and they hike less than what's priced?
Well, I would certainly agree that there's more upside risk to our forecasts than downside risk. And so to the extent that the market is pricing an expected value, like, it makes sense to me that it's on that side. I don't believe fiscal policy is generating a regime change in the way the U.S. economy works. Our trajectory for growth, which has it coming back down to potential at the end of next year, is consistent with that. In our fiscal forecast, we have no additional fiscal stimulus built in 2022 or beyond. And so it is very much our view that the political constraints will ultimately come back into force. And this burst of fiscal expansion that we're living with now is not going to be something that we're going to see permanently. That is very much part of our economic view, and it's part of our Fed view.
Well, with all of that, thank you both for joining. That's a wrap, and thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, as always, Jordan.
So those are the views from us, and that's the Fireside with Lewis and Rob. Thank you for listening into the podcast. If you enjoyed listening to the show or want to hear more from Nomura's economists, researchers, and investors, please like and subscribe to Nomura's podcast on Apple, Spotify, and SoundCloud, or wherever you do get your fill of podcasts. If you're feeling generous, please do leave a review on your podcast store of choice, preferably a nice one. And please do log on to nomuraconnects.com to keep up to date and keep on listening. Thanks, goodbye for now, and stay safe.